I'll just kind of recap where we are. As you all know, Access web apps are going away. And so we sort of changed the focus of this group from using Access web apps to surveying potential alternatives to Access web apps for people who had stepped into that ocean. I use that figure of speech a little bit sarcastically, but as we progressed, we have looked at 2 or 3, I think, potentially serious contenders to be alternatives. One was the Zoho Creator that Julian presented. We also saw George's previous presentation on the MVC, which is a .NET solution. We saw one last month for the script-based product, which I think has a lot of promise. I don't know if it was clear last month that the script case product actually generates PHP. So for those of us who are more Microsoft-centric, that may not be a top priority, but it did look to me I've seen it twice now, it did look to me like a really strong contender as far as ease of use and more, I would say, the drag and drop kind of design for the sort of introductory level developer. MVC that we're looking at now, I think, is a little more towards the more advanced user. I think it's simple enough. I've actually tried it myself. I think it's simple enough to get started that you can be successful quickly, but it might take a little more effort to become proficient with it. So I think if you're serious about it, it is worth the investment of time and effort, though, as a contender. So now with that, is George Young back, ready to go?
I am back.
Okay, great. Well, I will step out and let you take over. Maybe you should sort of refresh your background, who you are. We've got a few new people who were here last time.
Excellent. All right, thank you, George. This is, as George mentioned, is a follow-up to, I think, 3 months ago when we did sort of the basics of ASP.NET MVC as a potential migration path / solution for Access web apps. And we covered sort of the basic conversion all the way from the Access web app to the MVC and then putting it in Azure. And there were a number of, there was actually some really great Q&A toward the end, and enough so that we decided that there were some issues that we didn't have a chance to discuss that we wanted to spend some time being able to both cover those ones that we had enumerated and also allow sort of a free forum for questions and answers. So today we have from AWA to MVC Part 2, Advanced Topics. Here's the agenda, quick introductions. WCPMIS at Ignite. WCPMIS is one of the projects, is a project with one of my clients, and it actually is an Access solution that we built an MVC app on top of, and it was presented by Mick Albar at the Ignite conference, and so I wanted to quickly highlight that because it's sort of an example of what you can do with MVC while still keeping Access at the core of things. We'll have a quick review of what we covered a few months ago. This will be especially useful for the people that are new this time around. A review of the migration, and then a quick overview of ASP.NET MVC, and then we'll dive in, and this will be the vast majority of the time, into some advanced topics. And these are the ones that were recommended that we talk about: security, authentication and authorization, how do you deal with related data tables, and general UI customization. And again, we'll have plenty of time for follow-up and open questions from the participants, and then we'll wrap things up. Okay, so I am George Young. I started programming in the early 1990s with Lotus command language, and then went into VBA and Excel and Access. Actually, I think it was Excel Basic and Access Basic, and then subsequently VBA sort of became the unified programming language under those. Also in the early 90s, probably starting around 94, 95, I was in grad school with lots of free time, and so I learned web development, self-taught. Started with CGI, which was the early web programming model using a language called Perl. Then Microsoft came out with ASP Classic, and I did a fair amount with that, and then subsequently starting in around 2000, .NET. Also in grad school, I did a startup with a friend of mine called Bourbon Street Software. As you might guess, I was in New Orleans. Our product was called Internet Marauder, which was a spider that went out and crawled a URL that you gave it and downloaded whatever you wanted from that URL. And then I was hired by Microsoft as a web developer and technical writer. And I was there in Redmond from 97 to 2009. Since then, I sort of retired from Microsoft in 2009 and moved to Colorado, where I have a small consultancy, Dawson Butte Software. I work primarily with .NET, often, in fact, almost always with Access somewhere in the picture. And the city of Denver, which we'll talk about in just a bit, is among my clients. We also have a local in the Denver area, a brick and mortar Access User Group, which meets once a month at the Microsoft offices here in Denver. I'm the president of that group, and the vice president, Jim Pilcher, is actually the project lead on the City of Denver project, which I'll highlight in just a bit. So I think it was just a couple weeks ago, there was a big annual Ignite conference in Orlando, Florida by Microsoft. That's targeted at IT and developer. I think they get something crazy like 25,000 people. It's insane. There was an Access session that was presented by Microsoft Access Program Manager McCall Barr and Access MPP Juan Soto. And there is a link for it, and I will make these slides available. But if you go to Ignite, if you go to myignite.microsoft.com and just search for McCall Barr in the video library, this video will come up. It's an interesting video talking about sort of different ways of extending access beyond just the local ACCDB model. And Juan presents some examples of using Azure SQL Database. Another project by MVP Armin Stein in Bellevue is presented, and then the City of Denver project is presented. Let me quickly talk about that. If you do watch that video, the City of Denver stuff is from minute 46 to minute 50. The City of Denver project was originally, it was just an Access database with a split backend ACCDB, so the usual sort of corporate type situation. What we did based on the client requirements was to migrate the backend to Azure SQL Database. We then, and this was critical, we migrated the client up into an Azure virtual machine, and the immediate pressing reason for that, and this may be something that you encounter if you start looking at SQL backends for your Access applications, is that it was a very tightly controlled corporate network environment. And so getting the latest ODBC driver on everybody's machine was a problem. And having port 1433 open on the internet was a problem, right? This is a big government, office, controlled by centralized IT, with all sorts of checks and balances and requests and process. And so rather than fight that, we were able to put the client up in an Azure virtual machine that we could access using port 443. So the two ports that they had open on the network at the city were port 80 for regular internet traffic, and port 443, which is HTTPS for like secure SSL secured sites. And so we were able to create a VM in Azure and then have it use, instead of the default port for virtual machine, we were actually able to say, no, this guy needs to use 443, and then the city of Denver could just tunnel out to that, and we didn't have to worry about, do they have the latest driver? Do they, what drivers do they have? We totally control the virtual machine environment. The additional benefit of that was that because the virtual machine is in Azure along with the database, the latency to the database was significantly reduced. So the client can talk, at really, really fast speeds, like within Azure, within the Azure West US data center. I don't know how many terabits or petabits or whatever those internal pipes are, but very, very fast. And then from the VM to the user's desktop, you're only passing along the little pieces of the UI that update, which is pretty efficient. So it actually really made performance quite good too. So once we got that set up, then we built an ASP.NET MVC web mobile app against that same database. So with the Access client, the classic Access client, where we had a lot of meaty stuff and integration with Office applications and talking to local resources like printers and so forth and so on. We had that guy, and then hitting that remote SQL database. And then we built an ASP.NET MVC web mobile app against that. And what that did is it allowed us to expose certain parts of the database for different scenarios. So for example, somebody in the field, they were able to, we gave them a very simple UI for a certain task or a certain set of things that they needed to do on a regular basis, and they could do it out in the field on their phone. And then finally, Power BI, which is business intelligence, which is Microsoft's sort of data analytics tool. And because we had the data up in Azure SQL DB, it was very, very easy to generate some really nice infographic type views of what's going on with the data. And I have a few screenshots from the presentation right now that'll run through that real quick. So that's just, this is a screenshot this is a screen that McCall had at Ignite, and it shows some of the types of projects that the city of Denver works on using our application. So they basically have to manage all the purchasing and scheduling and resourcing, the contracts and so forth. You can see these big wastewater and storm drains and so forth and so on. This is the summary slide that McCall presented. So you can see rich access app, Azure SQL database, ASP.NET mobile friendly interface, integration with Office Apps, Power BI. And then what we had is we still had all the benefits of access, but we also had much greater access to the application data by virtue of it being in the cloud. And by virtue of having that single database and, for example, writing SQL views for common data access scenarios, then the client and the web actually share the same data access code. So we write, we'll write a query in one place in a view, and then the web uses it and the Access client uses it, which makes, the maintenance of a hybrid application, which could be complex, actually greatly simplifies that. This is an Access screen of the client running in the VM. So you can see it's your fairly standard Access application, and we got the drop downs and the related data, and this is a screen where you create a new project. So and you can see it's got a bunch of tabs up at the top and then a bunch of items within each of the tabs. A fairly complicated application for project management. This is what the Power BI integration looks like. Very, very easily done. We basically just had a few drag and drops within the Power BI environment, and then we create these interactive visuals to give management snapshots into what the data looks like. And this is actually interactive. So for example, if you were to come over and click on 2017, which is the purple bar with the 44 at the top, then all of that filters the entire set of charts. So the budget proposed by advertised year, that goes to only 2017. And then the list of projects over here, that filters to only 2017. And the budget amount here updates to reflect only the 2017 project. So it's a really, really nice interactive kind of clickable drill down graphic environment. In MVC, in ASP.NET MVC, we were able to generate sort of these small views, these mini views, if you will, of some aspects of the data. So this is the default ASP.NET. You get this for free out of the box. It will basically put a little hamburger menu at the top right, which you can see up here. And then your data renders down below. So you can see here on the left what we have is a project ranking summary that allows a user, in this case on the phone, to very quickly see what that looks like, and then they can print, save as PDF, which I believe is somewhat problematic in Access Web Apps. It's a piece of cake in MVC. Over here on the right, you see we have a dates table, and again, we have tabs at the top. And then a date grid down below, which shows all the grids with colors meaning certain things. And again, we didn't have to do any extra work to have this mobile view. It came for free, as you'll see when we go through the UI of building an MVC application just a little bit. A couple of other screens that we have are data entry. You can see on the left, add new project note, then we have a drop down, and then a note, a text area, and then a date field down below, and then you click to add a note. One of the benefits of this on mobile is that if you put your cursor in the note thing here, a mobile device will know, this is a text input, and it'll give you a microphone, a little microphone icon. So actually a user out in the field with no additional code having to be written by the developer, can actually allow voice to text notes in here, and then you add a note. Also here on the right, this is a default a jQuery calendar item. So when you click on the date field with your thumb or your finger in the mobile view of the site on your phone, for example, you get this little date calendar picker that you can click the guys to navigate between months, and click here to pick a date, and then it puts the date up here. So that's just some examples of kind of the great things that you can do with MVC. Many of these, I believe, which are not possible with Access Web Apps. Okay, I'll pause for any comments or questions before we go into the MVC part, if anybody has anything they want to throw at me right now.
I do have one. That date picker, that is, how difficult is that to implement, or is that just there?
Yeah, let me see. That's in WCP MIS. So let me go here to layout. Sorry for the context switch here. Shared layout. Hopefully it's on here. Here you go. So it's one line of JavaScript. You basically say where I have an input, which is a text box of type date time, and it's not a read-only text box, then put the date picker on it. That's it. It's part of the jQuery UI package, which comes with MVC when you create an application. So that is the extent of what I had to do that.
Okay, so it is a jQuery.
It's a jQuery date picker, yeah.
Okay, perfect.
So it's a standard, right? jQuery is sort of the standard JavaScript library, extremely well supported. So that's all that is. Yep.
Warren also has a question, but I cannot. Okay, go ahead, Warren.
Hi, George.
Hi.
So, George, your mobile app here, is that running on a Windows phone, or can it run on an Android or an iOS? Is it a PhoneGap build? How did you do that?
Yeah. So, thank you, Warren. This is just a web app. So it's just a URL.
Okay.
So now, what you can do is, and I've done this for one of my clients, is they didn't want to invest in writing an iOS app and an Android app and well, I don't think anybody's writing Windows Phones app, but an iOS app or an Android app. And so there are certain things you can do, like you can pin in iOS and in Android, you can pin an application icon to your home screen, so it looks like an app, and it kind of feels like an app. It's just that it launches in Safari or in Chrome rather than in the app shell.
Right. Okay, thank you.
Yes. I know a couple of months ago there was a similar question, and I think one thing you can do, I haven't researched it, but I know in the Windows world, you could build essentially just an application shell that hosted your web page. So you could essentially have an app that was downloaded and managed in the store that people would install, but it was essentially just a shell wrapper around a web control that then just ran your website. So that was sort of an intermediate option there.
Okay.
Thank you. Any other questions so far? Okay, great. So all these are built using ASP.NET MVC, and I want to quickly review the architecture of how this works. So MVC is Model View Controller, and the front end is built in C# or VB, and then you have HTML, which is the markup language like a table element or a text box element or a heading element. And then you have CSS, which is cascading style sheets, and that's where you style it and you set colors and heights and widths and so forth and so on. And then there's JavaScript, which is a client-side scripting language, which is absolutely optional. And I think as you saw on that screen that I showed in Visual Studio responding to George Hepworth's question, I had 2 lines of JavaScript there. One was to wire up the calendar, and another one was to make read-only fields look a little bit different. So that's the front end, and then the back end is SQL Server or Azure SQL Database. Now, when I'm talking about the MVC, I'm talking about the ASP.NET version. There are others. There's Ruby on Rails and a number of other different frameworks, but for the sake of Access users and developers, we're usually a Microsoft shop, and we're usually most familiar and comfortable with the Microsoft platform. So that'll be the focus of this. If you look on the right, that's a little bit abstract, but it hopefully gets a good idea of how things work. So you're the user, or the user is there on the bottom in the circle over here, and the user basically goes to a page. So they click a link, and that link in the URL has the information that the MVC application uses to route that request to what's called a controller. And what a controller does is he goes off and he talks to the database and fills in a model. And what a model is it's basically a code representation of your data. So for example, if you have a person table that has a first name, last name, and phone, then when you generate an MVC application, you get a model called a person, and that person class will have 3 properties: a first name, a last name, and a phone. And so what happens is the controller basically queries the database and says, give me the information to hydrate or to create an instance of that model. So the model gets filled with data from the database. That's the query part over there, and then manipulates over here on the right. And then the model, then once he's hydrated and filled and sorted and filtered and whatever else you want to do with that data, he then hands off to the view. And the view is, if you will, the form. The view is the HTML that actually renders the data. And then that goes back and that view is the page that's presented to the user. And these three components, model, view, and controller, are represented by folders in Visual Studio. So it's a pretty clear-cut separation of concerns, both in terms of doing the development and in terms of kind of conceptually understanding how it works. So that's MVC in a nutshell. The pros of ASP.NET MVC are the documentation, the amazing amount of documentation out there, samples, and the number of developers that use MVC. Very rich and powerful development tools. I mean, you've got, just full-blown Visual Studio, which is used to create, just about every type of application under the sun, and has amazing debugging and source control management, and just all kinds of great stuff. Syntax highlighting and statement completion and so forth. And we'll see a little bit of that. You also have full control of open development and hosting environments. So unlike maybe a few of the alternatives to Access Web App, you're not locked into, a certain development tool or a certain hosting environment or a certain way of doing things or a certain language. With MVC, you can write it in C# or you can write it in VB. It's industry standard, and you get mobile for free out of the box. So it'll generate a full-blown web app view, full screen, say for a desktop or a notebook, but you also get mobile for free out of the box. As I've talked to other Access developers, it seems like, and I know George and I and a couple of other folks were on a thread on LinkedIn recently, that perhaps the biggest hurdle to using ASP.NET MVC is that you're basically kind of stepping off the edge of a cliff in terms of not having any WYSIWYG. So instead of the Access development environment where you select a control and you drag it around and you drag a label and you click on it and you go to properties and you bind it to the data and you set its height and its width and its background color, all that being done in sort of a WYSIWYG visual way. In the web world, you're pretty much dealing with code. Now you very quickly see what the result of your code is. So that code compile view loop is very, very short. It's less than a second, but there's a disconnect between when you're in development mode and when you're in user mode, and that's a big paradigm shift for a number of folks who are used to, understandably so, who are used to the Access model. And of course, there's this new development paradigm of things like disconnected data sets and a model and a view and a controller, and it's not terminology and concepts that we deal with in Access. There are some parallels. A view is a form. A controller might be a module if you had a module that you use to handle all your data querying and manipulation. A module. A model, that doesn't really have a parallel because essentially, again, a model is just a code abstraction of your data. But it's cognitively challenging. Now, if for an Access developer who's played around with the web a little bit, it's much less challenging. But for someone who hasn't played around with any of the web stuff, writing a little bit of HTML, writing a little bit of CSS, it is definitely some cognitive dissonance. And that said, as you'll see, and as George mentioned at the beginning, it's very easy to get up and running very quickly. So you have a very shallow learning curve to get the basics up and going. But then as you need to do more advanced stuff, you have to drill down or find somebody who can do that for you. Now again, back to one of the pros, the first pro, the amount of documentation and samples that are out there, it's really, really easy to find solutions. There are so many people writing in ASP.NET that the stuff out there is very high quality for quickly finding out how to do something. And the other thing is that you will not run into the hurdles, the barriers that you run into with Access Web Apps. As I mentioned, I think a couple of months ago, probably my largest client, it started off as he came to me and said, "Hey, I have this Access Web App and I want to make it do this." And I looked at it and, I said, well, here's going to take me, it's going to take me 3 hours, and I can with bubblegum and baling wire, I can make it do kind of sort of what you want it to do. And then I said to him, I said, hey, you know what? I'll tell you what, I'm going to take 2 hours and I'm going to do the same thing in MVC. And I'm not going to bill you for it, but if you like it, we can go down this road. And that turned into a very large multi-project engagement, starting with basically a guy running into one of the constraints of the Access Web App, which is the relative inflexibility. And as you'll see as we going forward, and hopefully as you've seen from some of the examples that we presented earlier, you can pretty much do just about anything once you're in the .NET world. So there's a easy on board. If you wanna start doing the more complicated stuff, you have to drill down into it. Probably similar to, very quickly creating an access form from a simple table to where you were writing, inner join queries, and then a form based on a query. That took some additional learning. I think it's fairly analogous. So that's MVC. Now let's quickly review the migration that we did a couple months ago. So when you migrate from Access to SQL Server, from Access Web App to SQL Server, there are at least a couple approaches. And George, I meant to check that second bullet point under the first item with you. But one that we did a couple months ago was to basically pull the AACDB using Access. Basically build an AACDB out of the Access Web App data, and then from that ACCDB then generating a SQL Server database. And George, I know you did something where you get the AppX, and I think I called that wrong, but you basically save it as a zip and then extract a SQL Server. Is that correct?
More or less. What you can do very quickly is in the Access Web App there is backup, which creates what is called an app package, it's .app, which is essentially a zip file. So if you rename that extension to zip and open it, there's a file in there called the backpack. It's BAC PAC. And with that backpack, then you can import that as a data tier into SQL Server.
Great, thank you. Those are the two options. So first you got to get your data into SQL Server, and then two different ways of doing that. And then the second thing is to generate the Access Web App against your SQL Server database. And 3 steps to that: you create a new solution, you then create an ADO.NET entity data model. That's that model that maps from your tables to your into your code, and then you scaffold out controllers and views. And as you'll recall from last time, we didn't write any code when we were doing that at all. And then the third thing is to actually publish it up to a host, and we put that in Azure a couple months ago. So those are the 3 steps. I have this slide again. and I wanted to quickly highlight this. One of the nice things is that you're not going to spend any money if you do decide to start doing this. Visual Studio Community Edition is free. SQL Server Migration Assistant is free. SQL Server Developer Edition is free, so you can have a full-blown SQL Server instance running locally. And then if you want to play around with hosting in Azure, you get 10 websites for free. And then also you can get 5 databases for free with this Visual Studio Dev Essentials membership. And to sign up for that, you go to myvisualstudio.com, and that's also where you get SQL Server Developer Edition for free. So no upfront cost whatsoever. And you can run this stuff locally, or you can run some freebies in Azure. And then once you have a client who's wants to invest in, a full-blown hosting environment, you just convert your free Azure app plan to a paid plan, and you're looking at about $70 a month for any number of websites. I think in one of my clients, I think I have 10 websites. 10 websites running under that single plan for $70 a month. And then the databases will run you from $5 and up. And usually the $5 database is enough, $5 a month, unless you're running some pretty high level of transactions. Any questions so far?
Just one. The Visual Studio Dev Essentials membership, you have it noted as free. Is that free forever, or is that a trial period converts to a paying subscription?
I have seen no indication whatsoever that they would ever charge for that. So basically what it does is it's just a website, and all you do is you enter your Microsoft ID or Microsoft account, hotmail.com, outlook.com, whatever. And that just basically, allows you to then download stuff. And I'm trying to think when they introduced it, 2 or 3 years ago, I think. It's free. And I've never seen any indication that would ever charge for it.
Okay, so that's not an Azure plan. That's through the Visual Studio community.
Yeah, you go to myvisualstudio.com.
Okay.
And so I'm logging in. So I'm already going to have the stuff there. But you can see Visual Studio Community, Azure, $200 credit for an Azure account. Visual Studio Code. Where's the database? Tools. I wonder where the SQL database went. Okay, I must be missing that. But the developer edition is in here, or at least it was, unless they took it out. Yeah, but it's part of Visual Studio. So totally separate from Azure.
Before we move on, Warren has a question.
Yes.
Hi, George. Just a quickie. When you said $5 for a SQL database, what sort of transactions would you be able to do for $5? What sort of numbers? Or how many users would be hitting that for $5?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. Azure uses something called was it TPS or TPC or I can't remember. There's some, let's see, pricing details. So let's see. Single database, there we go. DTUs, there we go. So they have this thing called a DTU, which is really, I've never quite figured it out, but it's a measure of throughput. And so what they basically said is, well, we don't just want to say a number of users, or we don't just want to say, number of queries, or we don't just want to say, bytes of data output. So they came up with this DTU thing. here, which somewhere they actually say how they came up with that, and I'm not quite sure where that is. So somewhere in here it should say what a DTU is, but you can see here that they have a DTU. Let me click back and click on single. I'm sorry, and the base is 68 thousandths of a cent. It's $4.99 a month. And then it goes all the way up to $2,250 a month for 3,000 DTUs. So I don't know, Warren, if you can figure out what a DTU is, let me know.
That's awesome.
But that, yeah, and I think if you okay, what is an Azure?
Because you know what I have? I have on another private hosting company, they gave me SQL Web Edition for $25 a month.
Okay.
And there was just no limit to that, right? So that's how I thought, I wonder if I'm getting a good deal or not when you said $5.
Yeah, I mean it's the kind of thing that, yeah, so here's a Stack Overflow article that I think people try to explain it. But I just think it, and there's actually a query that determines it. I think that it's you just got to kind of sort of play around with it and see. Pretty much I use basic everywhere. I don't have, super high data transactions going on, but that basic level has been fine. And in the case of the city, we maybe have 10 concurrent users at any given point in time, and that's been more than enough.
What does the city pay?
I'm sorry?
And what does the city pay for that?
Yeah, we just basically pass through the billing to them. So, actually Jim at Data One does that, Jim Pilcher. So he basically gets a bill, every month for the city stuff. It's basically the VM, the web app service, and I think we have 2 or 3 databases at $5 a pop, and he just passes it on to them.
Okay. So it's not that much then.
It's not. Yeah, it's and the nice thing is, you only pay for what you use. So,
yeah.
You want to quickly see, hey, is my app going to improve if I increase the database throughput? Well, you quickly upgrade the database in the Azure portal, and you see if that works, and if it made a difference, and then if it didn't, well, you say, well, I'm just going to dial it down back to the basic level and look at something else. So, for an hour, you're being billed, $15 a month as opposed to, $5 a month.
And then you mentioned something about Azure costing what, $70 a month?
Yeah, so the basic app service plan in Azure, and that's for web apps, is $70, and that gives you in theory an unlimited number of sites and domains. And again, that's going to be a little bit of a function of traffic. So if you have a client who has a single website and they're very price sensitive, you could probably get them a less expensive MVC hosting plan than $70 a month. But if you have a client, for example, in the 3 clients that I have in Azure, they like that they can quickly put up a new site without any additional cost, and there's some flexibility there. Also, you can have the basic plan is $70, but that's also a certain amount of RAM, I think it's like 50 gigabytes of storage, and a certain processor size, certain processor speed. But in Azure, you can do a scaling. So you can say, oh, you know what, I want to actually make this have double the amount of RAM. Or instead of having one instance, of this virtual server, I want to have 2 instances. And you can do that just by dragging a slider or clicking a drop down in the Azure portal. The other thing you can do is you can set up dynamic scaling, so that, for example, you normally are running with one server, but you can have a little thing in there that says, hey, if the CPU usage goes over, let's say 80%, then add another instance of this server, and that'll basically give you twice the server horsepower serving up that site. And then you say, okay, when it drops below 60%, then give me just 1. So it'll actually dynamically respond to a spike, for example, and you'll only get billed again for that period where you're running 2 servers versus 1. Yeah. I can play around in the portal toward the end if you want to see a little bit more what that looks like.
Just one last question. So let's say you had a data-intensive application, lots of images. Would you store it in Azure? Where would you store that? Because a lot of guys here are using Amazon's storage. What do you prefer? Because obviously I like Microsoft as well, right?
Yeah, so you and I are probably in the same boat there. Basically, anything that the Amazon Web Services Azure has. So you have a couple of options for storing images. One is you can just store them in the web server file system and FTP them up, right? The old school. You have a folder in your file system that's called images or whatever, and you just FTP up images as you need to do that, and that works great. Another option is they have what they call blob storage, and that's a separate service, very inexpensive, but it basically you can have your images go up to that and live in that, and it's very, very efficient, specifically for serving up binary data. So you can have your website anywhere, and you can just reference the blob URL for where your image is going to be. So those would be the 2 options.
This is great because I'll just get one more comment in and I'll jump off because I know you've got time limitations. Alpha, you mentioned Alpha before, and I've developed applications in Alpha. Alpha has a cloud service now. They charge you their licensing fee $15,000 a year if you push it to the cloud. So this is like really, the numbers you're throwing out here are just totally to the other side.
Yeah, I mean, and you'll, it's that decision point. Do you want it just as easy as possible to get something up? And Alpha may be a very good approach for that. But if you want to have significantly lower costs and significantly greater feature set, and better integration with the whole Microsoft world, then MVC is a much better approach. And again, the difference is that you once you get beyond the basics, you do have to kind of roll up your sleeves with MVC, and you have to be willing to deal with angle brackets in HTML. And for people that don't want to go down that route, that's fine. The other alternative is, for example, in the case again of the city of Denver, where Jim Pilcher with Data One Inc. is he's been an Access developer for 25 years, I think. 20. That's today's, or this month is the 25th anniversary of Access. But he brought me in specifically, primarily for my .NET skills, but also because I knew Access and could understand and map from Access to MVC. He can do stuff in Access that I haven't done. He's much deeper in Access than I am. He writes custom Gantt charts using the report drawing APIs, stuff like that. Pretty complex stuff. So in that case, we have sort of a partnership where, he does the super duper low level access. I do the really complicated MVC stuff, and then we have an intersection where I can do a lot of the access stuff, and he can do some of the MVC. But that is another alternative, is to go into partnership. I believe that Armin Stein in Bellevue with J Street does that. I think he started off doing pretty much just pure access, and then as he had access, some of his access clients, wanted to move to either an enterprise level backend like SQL Server, or they wanted to have some type of web view, not replacing their major access database, but providing, some views on the data that in a web browser. Armin brought in MVC people, and I think I don't remember the numbers, but I think he's at least 50% MVC now. So yeah, so there's a few different models there.
I don't think you're going to get away without knowing HTML and CSS and JavaScript, because even with Alpha, they advocate low code, but it's not. Unless you're really basic, you got to dive in there and know your HTML and JavaScript and stuff like that.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I saw a demo of it a couple of years ago, but I haven't paid much attention to Alpha since then. So I didn't realize that you did pretty quickly have to get into HTML and JavaScript.
Oh yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, no, sorry. And then and this is one, I think, of the advantages of the MVC approach is that I'm not in like some weird, goofy boutique development environment trying to write JavaScript. I'm in Visual Studio where I have, the world's best development environment to write JavaScript. So to me, that was a big thing. That's interesting. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. All right, so we now have the advanced topics, but what I wanted to do was very quickly run through, just so we're all on the same page, doing this access to SQL and then the MVC application. So let me open a new instance of Visual Studio. I think I have a fresh one here somewhere. Maybe I don't. Okay, so start up new instance of Visual Studio. Okay, if you're curious in the details, you can go back to on the AccessUserGroups.org website. You can check out the video. I think it was from July or August, somewhere in there. But we'll just quickly go through this. So I'm going to go File, New Project. And that brings up the Visual Studio New Project thing, which is massive. I mean, I've got BI, C#, Basic, F#, C++, SQL Server, Python, big data stuff, data factories, JavaScript typekits, game development. I mean, you name it, it's in here. If I wanted to do this in Visual Basic, I'd go Visual Basic, Web, and then ASP.NET. I like working in C#, and I will talk about why that is in just a little bit, even though I love Basic. So I'm going to go C# Web, and then ASP.NET Web Application. And I'll go OK. And I will say no accounts, so we'll come back and talk about the accounts in a little bit. Pick MVC, OK. And Visual Studio is going to churn and generate basically a templated application. Visual Studio has this scaffolding templates that it uses to build out your basic application. So I'm going to close this page. So you'll see over here on the right, we have models, views, and controllers. So those are the key thing. Everything else, content is like images, fonts is fonts, scripts is if you have any JavaScript, but really the big guys are model, view, controller. And you work independently in those folders depending on which aspect of your application you're building. And ASP or Visual Studio comes with a built-in web browser, so you don't have to worry about IIS and everything. I'm just going to hit Control F5 to run this application, and it's going to pop it up in Visual Studio, or I'm sorry, in the browser. And you can see it's localhost, which is my local machine, and then it picks a port to make it unique for all the other applications. So this is the basic templated site that you get with nothing. This is your how to get started. So the second thing that we have to do is to, if we go back to our screen, is to create an entity data model. So this is where we're basically gonna tell Visual Studio to look at our database and pull the schema out of it and bring it into our application. So I'm going to come back over to Visual Studio, and I right-click on Models, and I go Add ADO.NET Entity Data Model. One of the daunting things about Visual Studio, I mean, just look at these dialogues, right? I mean, there's a lot of stuff here, but there's very, very little that you actually have to work with. So the new data model, I'll just call it Model 1. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick what type of model I want, and I'm pulling it from a database. So I have this one. Another thing you can do in Visual Studio and in ASP.NET MVC and Visual Studio, you can actually write your class and have your class generate your database. But we're pulling it in from a database that we converted from Access to SQL. So we're going to pull in the designer from the database. Next. Now we have to say, where is the database? And it's going to be on my local machine. And just going to Northwind Orders, which is the database that we converted last time from ACCDB to SQL. You recall we used the SQL Server Migration Assistant to do that, which was real easy. I'll test the connection. It's good. So I'm telling Visual Studio, here's the database I want to use to generate this model. It gave it a name called Northwind Orders Entities. Now, entity, familiar with the database language of entity diagrams and entity models. It's basically those are the classes that it's going to build. So I'll go next. Use Entity Framework 6, and now what it's doing is it's actually talking to the database, and it says, "Oh, I found these tables in here. If I had views in that SQL database, I would pull them into. If I had stored procedures, I could pull them into. But I'm just going to pick the 5 data tables, and I'm going to go finish. And what Visual Studio is going to do is to create this data model, and it's going to examine that database and say, oh, okay, here's a table called customers, here's a table called employee, here's a table called order, here's a table called order detail. Order detail is related to order in a many-to-one relationship. Here's one called product. And it's going to build a class for each of those tables. And you can see it builds also a nice entity diagram as well. So you can see we have order kind of at the center of the universe, and order has a customer, order has an employee, order has order detail, and order detail has products. And you can see the one-to-many relationship here that it's built up for us. So it's basically built this diagram for us automatically out of, but just by examining our database schema. And if we go over here to the
George?
Yes.
We lost your...
Oh, this happened before, didn't it?
Yep.
I apologize. Let me know when you can see the screen.
You are back.
Okay, I apologize. I think it happened at the same point last time. A couple months ago. So we have the entity data up here. It's built all the relationships. Yeah, this doesn't kind of looks a lot like an Access designer, the Access relationship window. Notice, however, that it creates these navigation properties. This is real interesting. So what it does is it says, hey, an order has a customer in a many-to-one relationship. So I'm going to create this navigation property called a customer, so that now when I'm writing my queries, I can just say order.customer. Similarly, an order has employees in a many-to-one relationship, I can say order.employee. Similarly, an order has many order details, I can say order.order-details and get a list of all of the details. And at the same time, an order detail has an order. So you can see that it's basically builds these entities that map to the related tables for us. Also notice, please, here on the right that in the models folder, which was empty, we now have this model 1. And notice that we have these customers.cs, employee.cs, order.cs, order detail.cs, and product.cs. So if we look at the order, you can see that we have these properties that are on each of the model classes. Let me bump this up a little bit so people can see this okay. That's probably too big. There we go. So you can see that for every field in that table, it built a property, with a get and a set. So it's built that out for me automatically. And you'll notice that I've got these underscores. Well, what happened is that SSMA saw those underscores and says, well, SQL doesn't like underscores. I'm just going to, these were spaces in Access. And so, because spaces are okay in field names in Access, but SQL doesn't like them. So SSMA did that for us automatically. And then down here, you can see we have a collection of order detail called order details. We have an employee type called employee and a customer type called customer. So that's that code mapping of what we saw in there. And it's the same for all these. So here's what a product class looks like. ID, code, name, optional, standard cost, a list price, a quantity per unit. So this is all generated for us automatically. Again, you first look at this, and if you haven't dealt with this sort of entity code world, it's a bit overwhelming. But the nice thing is that this is just under the covers. We really aren't really concerned about this. This is just auto-generated for us, and it's how we're going to be able to talk to our database from our application. So we built our model. We built our data model here. Oh, did I lose this again? I think I know what happens.
Yeah, we lost you.
I hit a keystroke combination, which is Shift-Control-S to save all in Visual Studio, and I think Shift-Control-S is also for stop sharing in Skype.
That sounds right.
Yeah, yeah. So I apologize, and I'm not going to hit that keystroke again. Okay, so we have our model built. Now what we need to do is to generate the UI. And the way that we do that is that we scaffold out controllers and views. So you recall back from the MVC thing that the user clicks on a link. That link contains information that the controller uses to know what to do. The controller queries the database and populates that model. So that class that we were just looking at turns into a list of basically records populated with data from the database. And then the view renders that data back to the user. So we built the model. Now what we're going to do is we're going to use that model to automatically generate the controller and the views. So it's all very sort of, reflective discovery type stuff. The Visual Studio looks at something and figures out how to build something from that. And then the next step is you look at the thing that you just built to figure out how to build the next thing. It's interesting. So we built the model, and now from the model we're going to build the views and the controller. So let's expand the controllers folder. See, we just have a home controller, which was the simple demo page. And then in views, we have the home, where we have a view for each of the pages associated with the home, about, contact and index. And then we have a shared folder which has this layout page, which is sort of a wrapper for all of our pages. But we have home and shared, and we have controllers. We just have a home controller. So let's generate that orders controller. So we just go add new scaffolded item. So again, I right click on controller, add new scaffolded item. MVC controller with views using entity framework. And I click add. And now I pick the class. So what table, what model do I want to use? So we're going to do order right here. The data context class is that entities, Northwind orders entities. And then it's going to build something called an orders controller. It's also going to build an orders folder of views. So we'll have a couple new things show up. We'll have an orders controller here under the controllers folder, and we'll have the orders views here under the views folder. So let's just go ahead and click add. Oh, I didn't build a project. So one thing you have to do after you've built out your model, you have to build your project. So build solution, build solution. I'm not going to use the keystroke because it'll probably disconnect me. Okay, so you can see my build succeeded. And now I'm going to go over here again and now right click, add new scaffolded item, MVC controller, add, order, Northwind entities, add. So and you'll notice if you'll note on the right in our tree view, we'll have an orders controller show up and we'll have a bunch of views under orders there. So there's our controller here, orders controller, and then under views we now have an orders folder and it's created create, delete, details, edit, and index. Now these are the CRUD views. Create, read, update, delete, and then you also have a list view. So now if I hit Control F5 again, which is my shortcut for building and running the web page, now I have this thing called an orders controller, and the way that MVC handles that routing for a controller is it has a convention that says, well, anything that has controller at the end, just access it by calling the name of the controller. So we'll just call it orders, /orders. And if I hit this, now what I should get is a list of all the orders in my database. And there they are. I'll go ahead and maximize this and maybe bump up the view a little bit. So there is everything in the database, unvarnished, no massaging, no nothing. That's the index view. You recall we have a details view. It automatically scaffolded out a details link for us. So if I click that, there are my details. I have an edit view on that, and if I click edit, now I get edits. Notice that where they were related, those many to one, notice that it's built a drop downs for me automatically for both the employee and the company. And then if I go back to the list here, I can also delete, and it'll ask me to confirm, are you sure you want to delete this? And I can either do that or I can say no, go back to the list. So let's go ahead and edit this guy, and we're going to change Karen Toe. We'll change her to Karen Toe Ray Me. So I'm going to scroll down, click Save, and now you see now we have Karen Toe Ray Me. I can go back and edit again and get rid of that. And I can just hit enter to save it, and now we're back to Karen Toe. I can add a new order, and we'll say it's today. It hasn't shipped yet. The ship date is okay, so I'm just going to create a new order. Let's just say that you're working with Stephen Thorpe, And your company is actually, is there company Z? Yeah, you get company Z. Great. So now if I scroll down to the bottom here of my list, I should see George down here. And there we are. So that's what's generated for you out of the box. So this is sort of that initial very short on-ramp to getting something up and running that's actually a full-blown SQL Server database in the cloud with a website. I want to show you the mobile thing. So notice here that I have the label and the control next to each other, this layout. But if I go into, if I'm on a phone, this is not going to work real well. Well, the MVC scaffolding system uses something called Bootstrap, which is basically a layout, a template that will automatically adapt to mobile. So I've just hit F12 to open up the developer window in Chrome. It's the same in Edge. And I'm going to click this little guy down here on the left where it says Toggle Device Toolbar. And this is going to turn it from a full PC into a cell phone. And you'll see what will happen up here is that these guys will stack automatically. So I'm going to click that. And notice that now I have the label above the control. It still works the same, so I can go ahead and make edits and changes in here, and I still have my save button if I want. So you get, this is the mobile that you get for free. Notice also that menu that we had on the in the full screen view, which I'll go back to, Home, About, Contact. When I go into mobile view, now I get them is part of a drop down, and that's you get all that for free. So so what you were seeing in the screenshots that I showed earlier of the City of Denver site were basically this. And we did obviously did a lot of UI tweaking on top of that, but that was essentially that.
Can I ask a question here?
Yes.
Okay, so you're showing us this in the browser. Do you have to do anything differently in the publish process to make this happen, or if you just from a phone you get the same view?
Yeah, yes, there's nothing special. What happens is that Bootstrap uses screen width to figure out how it's going to display. So I can show you that real quick. So over here in content, bootstrap.css, and I'm just going to go down to the bottom. So you can see it has something like media min width 768 and max width 991. So Bootstrap built into it has these ranges of screen width that it works with to decide how it's going to show what and if it's going to hide some stuff, or if it's going to show stuff, or if it's going to wrap or not wrap, or stack, or have it working. And when you publish up to the web, whether it's in Azure or Amazon or anywhere, this code will still work. And it doesn't have to know that you're on a phone. It just has to know, oh, you know what, your screen width is less than 768. So similarly, if instead of doing this using the Google toolbar, if I just came here and started resizing and drag this guy here, you'll see that you see how that popped there? So right there we crossed that 768 pixel. And now, but you notice we still have a full menu bar up top. So now I'm going to keep coming into the left. Oh, now we have the hamburger menu. So at that point it says draw me a hamburger. At that point it says I don't need a hamburger, but I need to stack the labels. And if I go a little wider, it's going to say, oh, I'm wide enough that I don't even need to stack the labels. So all that is built in, is part of the framework. And again, Bootstrap is super well documented out there. So you don't even, there's no proprietary, you got to pay more money for this kind of thing or that. It just works. And Bootstrap has all kinds of interesting things like, different colors that you can use, and you just put a class on it. It has drop-down menus and pop-ups, and it's all totally out here with sample code to use. So yeah, that's where that comes from.
Excellent. That's really nice.
Cool. Okay. So now that we're on the same page, are there any other questions about what we've done? So basically, it was essentially a two-step process. One was get our access database into SQL. And then the second process, which is the one we reviewed, was now that I have the database in SQL Server, generate the application, which is what we did with those two major pieces. First, generate the model, and second, scaffold out the application itself. Any other questions before we move on to some of the advanced topics? Okay. So these are questions that came up last time or in conversations I had with George Simpson. The first one is security. What about security? So the first thing I'll say is that Azure itself, if you host in Azure, is an enterprise class hosting environment. As you probably know, it's mission critical to Microsoft. And the recent increases in the Microsoft stock have been primarily, if not exclusively, a result of their cloud growth. And the last number I saw for the previous earnings report, which was a couple months ago, was that Azure had grown 100%. So the revenue from Azure had grown 100% year to year. It is perhaps the most important investment that Microsoft is making right now. It's used by about 90% of the Fortune 500 companies. They have software and hardware threat monitoring in addition to real-time notifications. So I had the story of a client that I may have mentioned last time who was using a local provider, and they had they'd had a denial of service attack, and it had shut them down. And so the local ISP sold them basically renting them a piece of Cisco, an expensive piece of Cisco hardware that was costing them about $1,500 a month in addition to their hosting fees. And when they brought me in, I recommended that we move to Azure, and they have not had a single denial of service then, and they're saving about $2,000 a month from that. I mean, Microsoft hosts Office 365 in Azure, so it's getting the best possible security defense that it possibly can. Azure SQL Database itself is a service, so it's not just an instance of SQL Server. It's a service that is managed. It's a database service managed. Underneath the covers, there's SQL Server databases, but there's a whole management service on top of that, so that the actual databases themselves sit behind threat mitigation barriers and monitoring. In addition, the user can actually very easily control which, if any, ports are open, and you can change which ports you want to use. Actually, let me take that back. That is not implemented yet. You cannot change the port. Well, no, I don't think you can. I think it's 1433, but you can control which IP addresses can access that. So by default, when you first create the Access SQL database, only the IP address from which you created that database is open. Everything else is closed. So nobody could access that database from a different port. And then you can go in and say, oh, I want to open up this port, or I want to open up this range of ports. So for example, if you know everybody in your company is in a certain IP address, you can open up that range of IP addresses for that database, and nobody else can get to it. Which is another way. You can also do things like data masking and other advanced techniques, role-based access control. There's a lot of security built into the database service. And the Access web app, the same thing. It sits behind those same Azure threat mitigation barriers and monitoring. And then there's stuff you can do just to make your site more secure. For example, you can require HTTPS. And that's as easy as just putting require HTTPS attribute on your controller, or you can set it globally in the web configuration file or in code. So you can require that every piece of access, every access to your site is over HTTPS. Any questions on security or on what I've covered before we move to the next thing? Okay, great. So the next one is authorization and authentication. So, and this is obviously a very important topic. How do you control what users can use your application once you put it out there in the cloud? There are 3 types of authentication out of the box in Visual Studio. You have individual user accounts, which is basically user and role tables that are put in your local SQL database that then you didn't deploy to Azure. So basically you have an application specific set of authentication tables that are set up for you automatically, and you manage that by adding users and roles and assigning users to roles and so forth and so on. And that's all in that local SQL database. And that's pretty good if you just have, a single application where you just have a defined set of users that you don't need to either share across other applications, or if you don't have another means of authenticating those users. Within those user accounts, you can also say, oh, I want to support Facebook, or I want to support Google Auth, or I want to support Microsoft Auth. So you can add third-party authentication on top of that. They still have to have a local user in your system, but then that user in your system can map to a Google account, so they will only ever in the future log in using their Google ID, for example. The second one is work and school accounts, which is the kind of goofy name that Microsoft has for essentially Office 365 or Azure Active Directory. So when you create an Office 365 business subscription, an Azure Active Directory for that domain is set up automatically and populated in the background. So anytime you add a new Office 365 user, that user gets added to an Azure Active Directory that's associated with that account. You can use this for authentication for your application. And this would be very similar to, I think this is the one that's most similar to SharePoint and Access Web Apps, because of course one of the constraints of the Access Web App is that it had to be hosted in SharePoint. So you're going to have Office 365, or maybe in some cases you're dealing with on-prem, but let's assume Office 365. Those same Office 365 accounts that you used to control access to that Access Web App can be used to control access to your web app living in Azure or anywhere else. It's a really nice solution because you don't have to manage the logins. What happens is that you hit the site, and the site then says, oh, this site requires authentication, and because you identified it as a work and school account app, as an Office 365 auth app, it hands it off to Microsoft. So it goes into, I think, to login.microsoft.com. And login.microsoft.com handles, the security, the credential management, the user management, all that stuff you don't have to do. And you can just let Microsoft take care of that. And then you can also add third-party users to your Azure Active Directory and allow them to use your application as well. And that's something you do in the Azure portal. You say, oh, I want to add, Fred at google.com, and you add him as a guest user in Azure, and then he gets an email saying, hey, this application wants to add you as a guest user, and if Fred says yes, then he can come back and log in to that application. So it's a really, really nice solution. And the third one is Windows authentication, which uses NTLM for Internet applications. If we take a look at what that looks like in Visual Studio, let's go ahead and open a whole new instance here. And I'm going to go ahead and go back in and go New Project. And we'll do the same thing, .NET application, OK. And then here, as I select MVC, I also select the authentication. So no auth means there's no authentication at all. Individual user counts, it's going to scaffold out those additional tables that I need. But let's take a look at the work and school accounts. So you can either have it off of a single Active Directory or multiple organizations or on-prem. We're just going to do the single one. I think that's the most the usual story. And I'm just going to go dawsonbutte.net. Hopefully it's going to come back. I'm going to say, yeah, read the directory data. And let's see. It should have tried to validate that. Let's see what happens. Ah, now it gives me the login. Okay, so gcyoung at. So I've just signed in. Okay, I should have tested this. The last time I did this, it worked, but it's been a little while. That's interesting. Let's try gcyoung@live.com and see what happens. I'm pretty sure I'm an admin on that account. It's probably going to fail too. Yeah. Okay, let me try one more time. I apologize. Surprised this is. I wonder why this isn't working. Okay. So something has gone wrong with my permissions, and I'm not able to do that. You'd think gcyoung@dawsonbutte.net would be allowed to access dawsonbutte.net. That's, Well, I apologize. In theory,
Well, obviously, it's very secure.
yes, it won't even let me in. I will have to go back and figure out why this isn't working, because this has worked in the past. But what this does is it scaffolds out the login for using the Microsoft login service in Azure, and it's really nice, because then you basically just hand off to that to the Microsoft login service, and you don't have to manage any of that. I'm really perplexed why this doesn't work. I apologize for that not working. So now what you can do also, and I've done this, I have for example, one of my clients, I don't have access to their Active Directory, so I can't come in and do this here. It's going to fail just like it's failing now, and not going to let me log in. I'm going to try one more time. I'm a glutton for punishment. I do need to rebuild this machine. Yeah. Okay. But what you can do in the portal also is you can have somebody that, let's say your client can go in and they can add your application subsequently to that Active Directory. So even though you may not have access, which obviously I don't right now, even to my own for some reason, somebody who did have access would be able to go in and then add this application to the Azure Active Directory, and then it could make use of that. And I actually do that quite a bit, both with the city of Denver and with other customers, because I'm not in their Active Directory. Oh, bummer! I'm bummed that didn't work. It does a real nice job scaffolding out the authentication. I wonder if it has to do with this. This, I apologize. Let me just see if there might be something broken in Visual Studio when I added a different credential. Okay, see, it says re-enter your credentials. And then it says re-enter. Yeah, something's busted in Visual Studio. This is actually, you can see I'm still in 2015. I need to wipe this machine and put 17 on it. So I apologize for that, but it does work under normal circumstances. And then roles can come from your local SQL database, from Azure Active Directory groups, or from Office 365 groups. So you can create a group in Azure that says, okay, you know, my app admins, and add users to that. And then you would in your web app, you would say, oh, well, authorize all admins. And I can show you what that looks like. That's actually really nice. So on our application where we have the orders controller, you know, we say that, okay, we have the get order, which shows all, and we have the order details, which shows a specific one, and we have creating an order create. But let's come down to where we have edit, and let's say that we only want admins to be able to edit. So on this controller, or on this action, we would just say authorize, and then say roles equals admin. And that's all it takes. And now this action is limited only to somebody who has an admin role, and nobody else can get to that. Similarly, for delete, I could do the same thing, and I could have any number of a set of roles to do that. And I can also authorize based on users, which is of course less robust, but I could come in here and say, you know, user is equals, and then you know, GC Young at. Of course, that'll probably fail given my authentication issues with my machine. But so you can, and it's as easy as to protect actions, access to your application, just using that attribute, which is real nice. So you get a real explicit way of identifying who can do what. You can also put that on the controller itself. So at the very top of the file, here where I have the controller, I can say roles equals admin. So now nobody can access this controller except the admin. And let's say that, well, we have one method where we want to allow anybody to have access. So allow anonymous on that one, and that's all it takes. So now only admins can access any part of my orders section of the site, but anybody can get to the index who's logged in. So the ways of pretty easily controlling authentication. Any questions on that? And apologies again for the demo failure there.
One real quick question. What is the experience if someone is not authorized? Does the link show up still on the page, or the view, I mean, or does it just refuse to display the page?
Yeah, so you can do either. By putting it on the controller like this, or on a method, it's going to basically give it an unauthorized error. But you can also hide it in the view. So over here, let's go over to the index view. And you'll notice that here's where we have the links to edit and details and delete. I can also say if user.isInRole admin, and then I'll just put the brackets there, and I'll just put the edit link in there. So that will actually hide it unless they're an admin. So by default, it would be there if I had not done that, but it's protected from access in the controller, and it's protected, well, protected is the wrong word, but it's hidden from the user by using this if user is enroll method here on the link itself. So in theory now, if I rebuild this, and if I go back to this page, and we go to the list here, let's see if the edit link goes away. Yeah, you see how the edit link disappeared? Hopefully. So now it just says details and delete. And if I come over here and I get rid of this code here that I just put in, and now I leave edit just for everybody, and I come back over here and I hit refresh, now you'll see the edit link show up again here. But if I click that, you see I get a beautiful HTTP 401 unauthorized. Now I can set up, and this is the local experience. This is the totally unvarnished. When I deploy to Azure, and I'm in debug mode here when I'm building, So I don't know if you can tell here, but here in the drop-down it says debug. So that's the mode I'm in. When I deploy to Azure or to a host, it goes into retail, or was it release? Release, which doesn't have the debug symbols, and then this will actually be like a nice error page. It won't look as hideous, but this is good for debugging. So that's that. So yes, you can hide it both. You definitely want to protect it at the controller level, but then you can also hide it from the user there so that they don't click it, and then yeah.
Can I interrupt for a second? I just, Peter just had to leave. It's like 2:30 in the morning where he is in Germany, and he had to bail out. So I'm wondering if, we're like an hour and a half.
I'm sorry.
Is timing question for anybody else?
And I can wrap up in 5 minutes. I apologize.
No, I lost track of time here. I was fascinated by all the, trying to track it all, and it's my fault for losing track of time. But does anybody else want to stick around for a little longer? Hopefully. Any issues there? Okay, great. Looks like Warren is in for the duration. Tom's in for the duration. Okay, let's go for however much longer. Another 15 minutes. Is that?
Okay, we'll cap it at 15. I apologize. I lost track.
No, that's no problem. No, not a problem. Like I said, I just lost track of time and until Peter said he had to go to bed.
Yeah, you're like, what?
Yeah. All right. Thanks. Go ahead.
Well, thankfully he's in Central European time zone and not Pacific, or we'd really be in trouble if he was going to bed already.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So advanced topics related data tables. So unlike Access Web Apps, related table UI is not automatically scaffolded. In fact, that's one of the really, really, really great things about the web app is that you automatically get the related data tables. Now, the same scaffolding template that's used when we say, when we right-clicked and said add scaffolded item and it generated that order controller in the orders views, we could have a modified scaffolding template that said and also build out related table data. So we could do that. I've played with the idea of doing that. I haven't gotten around to doing it. And there may already be a template out there that does that in the public domain. But generally, to view related data, you just write a for each loop on the child table object, and that outputs the HTML, and you output the HTML for each record. So let me go back to the view, and we'll take a quick look at what that looks like. So we're going to go to the details view, and again, this is all the auto scaffolded stuff, where we see the the customer and all that. And if I go in here to the page and click on the details for this, I probably should remove the controller directive here. So we'll go ahead and open this up here and not. The other nice thing, by the way, as you saw, is that I put those, I was basically able to see the effect of the authentication stuff locally, even though I wasn't actually hooked into an authentication system, which is kind of nice. Okay, so let's go back and view this page again, and I'm going to view the details for this order. So here we have order date, ship date, all that, and you see it ends with last first. And if we go over here, you can see we end with last first. And then here is these two links at the bottom, edit and back to list. And here they are, edit and back to list. So what I would do is just write a for each loop. And this is where that model stuff is so interesting. So I'm in something up here at the top. I'm in my model. So the base object that I'm working with is called model. And my model is essentially consists of one order. So I'm going to scroll back down to the bottom, and I'm going to say for each, and I can say var detail in model, and now watch what happens when I hit dot. See, I have all of those properties there, but I can also go and get order details. If you think back to when we first generated the data model, we had that schema, that entity diagram with the relationships diagram. Remember, we had those navigation properties below all the scalars. This is where this comes from. So it says, oh, here's a collection of order details. So now I'm going to detail within model.orderDetails. So now if over here I can let's just build a list. So we're going to build an unordered list, and I'm going to have a list item. Actually, I want to put that outside of the loop because I only want a list item in the loop. So li, and notice I get the auto completion. It put a closed li, and I'll just go at detail dot, and now I'm in the order detail table. So I can say detail dot product. Now product is a child table of order detail. So now product dot and product name. So let's just save this. Again, what did I do? I created a little bit of HTML, an unordered list, and within that list container I said, okay, for each detail in the order details, get the detail, product table, product name field value. So I'm basically drilling down using this object property syntax, which you're very familiar with from VBA or from scripting in the expression builder in Access or in Access Web Apps. And I'm going to come over here, Alt Tab over and hit F5. And now we see she bought beer and dried plums. So that's now drilled down into that child table. I could very easily have this be a table instead of a list and get more data. So let me just click in this UL and change it to table. And notice how it changed that closing tag for me automatically. It also gives me a squiggle because it knows LI is not a valid table thing, but I do have a table row. And then I'm going to have table cells. So I'm going to change this LI to a TD. And again, this again is that cognitive thing. You know, I'm dealing with angle brackets and text. This is Notepad on steroids rather than a nice WYSIWYG. So again, this is where it's maybe a little bit of a challenge. So I'm going to do another cell at detail dot quantity. So I'm getting the quantity of this order detail from the order detail page, and I'm getting the product name from the product from the product table. And let's add the code. So product code, and let's get a total. So we'll put a price. I'm going to copy paste and detail dot price, unit price, and now let's do a total, TD at, and then I can say detail dot quantity times detail dot price, unit price. And it's probably going to tell me we got a double here and a decimal, and I want it in. So I'm going to cast it to a decimal, and now it'll give me a decimal output. So hit that, hit F5, let's see if it fails. So there I have the code, the beer, the code, the name, the quantity, the unit price, and the value. Let's take a look at some of the customization we can do. Again, we talked about using CSS, and with Bootstrap, you actually have CSS already written for you based on classes. So if I say class equals table, and I hit save, and I go back over here, you'll notice that this table is going to look a lot nicer. I've got lines and so forth and so on. I can even make it condensed. And that's going to make those rows a little bit narrower or shallower. And I can say striped.
George, are those Bootstrap classes?
Yes, they are.
Okay.
Now I'll go striped. And now hopefully we'll get, there we have a stripe there. So we get a little bit of the offset. And I can even say table hover, And now as I move my mouse over, hopefully it'll, there, you can see we get a little bit of a row highlight. Hopefully that shows up. So that's some of the built-in CSS that you can use. You can also have your own CSS. So let's go ahead and just put a style block just for grins, and let's say that table, and we'll say font, and notice I'm getting syntax completion, size equals 24 point. So F5, and in theory we'll have, there we go. So that's how I can change that. If I want to set a color, color equals pink. It's going to get uglier and uglier. So now I have pink text here. Maybe I want it to be italic font text. Let's see. What is the italic? Font style.
Style.
Italic. F5. So I mean, you can see you can make your web pages just as ugly as you can make your Access forms. Now, what about this thing about this lack of formatting on these numbers? So I can do. We're not going to have time to do it, but I can create a metadata file which basically says, hey, this guy is going to always render like this, or I can use the toString method and say that he's going to be a currency, with two decimal places. So toString with the C2, and now hopefully this 14 is going to turn into $14. And then I could do the same thing over here. I need to put another wrapper bracket on this to make sure we're all inside here. toString. Okay, and F5. And now we've got the 1400 and so forth. Let's say I want these. Let's say I want these cells. These three cells are numbers. I want them to be aligned right. So I can say like TD nth child 3, and then I'm just going to copy him. Again, this is getting a little bit esoteric, but this is all really basic stuff. I mean, there aren't a whole lot of commands that you have to know. And now we're getting into the more detailed. So text align right. So now hopefully 3, 4, and 5 are going to be aligned to the right. And there we go. One of the interesting things about CSS, and I'll end with this, is that you can set it globally. So notice that we're not setting properties on individual elements. We're basically saying, hey, any TD that's the third guy in the table, any TD that's the fourth guy in the table, any TD that's the fifth guy in the table, align him to the right. And I could put this up in my global CSS on my layout page or even in a CSS file, and it would basically know that every single TD in the table that's the third, fourth, and fifth is going to be aligned right. Or I could create my own class. So I could say td.right, okay, and get rid of all these guys. And I'm going to come down here and I'm going to say class equals, and I don't know if you can tell, but right is highlighted in my little box there in my drop down. So Visual Studio says, oh, you created a class on a TD called right. I'm going to show it in your autocomplete. So right, and I'm just going to copy it and put it on these guys. And I'm going to save it, over here, hit F5, and now hopefully those guys will all be aligned to the right. And now I can make this global, and anywhere in my app, wherever I want a thing to be aligned to the right, I can do it that way. And I can do date formatting like to short date and so forth and so on. Set background images, all kinds of things. But I think So unlike AWA, the developer has utter complete control over the UI. HTML defines a semantic structure. CSS is used to change the appearance. So that is pretty much it on the customization, and I'm sorry I ran so long.
No problem. Before we move on, I think we had another question. Is this a good time to?
Yes, I will stop talking and entertain any questions.
Okay, go ahead, Warren. Could you repeat your question?
Oh, it was me. Good. So a quick question here. What about predefined controls? Does MVC have that as well? Like, let's say a grid control.
Yes, there is a class called web dot. Let me see. I use it in WCPMIS. Let me go over here real quick. Sorry, I just want to make sure I have this. Let's see. Reports. Let's go to cost estimate. Sorry, I'm going to go up to the controller. I apologize. You can see this is a pretty big application here, so let's go to cost estimate. So yes, so here's something called a grid view. Let me bump this up.
Mm-hmm.
So here's a grid view. So there are those, and this is under system.web.ui.web controls. So if I say so you have an add rotator, access data source view. Let's see what we got in here. Validators, bound columns, which are on the grid, bullet stuff, button columns, all kinds of things that you can make use of if you want to. So yes, absolutely. And then there also are, things like, that come with Bootstrap and jQuery. And then you also have the ability to add third-party ones to your project. So if you come in here and you say, let's see, tools, NuGet package manager, manage NuGet, is that where it is? Okay. So if I go to MVC grid and I just search for that. So you can see there's a page list, there's a grid MVC, there's a grid MVC Ajax. So all kinds of free add-ins that you can get to as well. So yes.
We need a version 3 of this topic.
I'm sorry, I know.
So there's so many interesting things to talk about.
Yeah, let's negotiate another session for some time down the road. I think if we'll just give it back to George to summarize and wrap up, and then we'll let everybody go. This session has definitely gone a little longer. I think it's partly because everybody, including myself, is a little more fascinated by what we're seeing. So I think it warrants another meeting if we can work that out. So with that, go ahead and wrap it up, and we'll plan to meet again next month.
Great. Happy to come back whenever you want. I again apologize. So there is a. Did I lose my full screen? I did. Okay. There is a really nice tutorial on database first development at the Microsoft Docs for ASP.NET. And this basically sort of mimics what we did in terms of starting with the database and then generating your scaffolding, and then it goes into customization. So and I think it's like 11 topics. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4. Oh, it's actually much shorter. But this will, and it gets into a little bit of customization. So I would say if you browse through this guy here, and I'll put the slideshow in the chat window here in just a sec. This will give you a really good idea of what's involved at a higher level in terms of investment and what you have to learn. So highly recommended. This is a good overview for that. And that is my final slide. Let me pull up that folder so that I can quickly drop this into the Skype chat window. And hopefully everybody will get their hand on this. And again, I apologize for running so long. Okay, let's see here.
There's no need to apologize. It was excellent.
Definitely not a problem. We were all glued to our monitors for sure. Appreciate the time. I appreciate everybody sticking with us. We will have the recording done, I think, next week. I don't know how, I think it may take a little longer because I'm going to have to do it myself. We normally had Lucy do it, or now Sally, and I forgot to introduce Sally, and she's gone again. Well, I will do that next month for sure. Remind me, everybody who is attending, remind me that I have to introduce Sally. She has taken up the baton from Lucy, and I'm sure she will get this recording up very expeditiously as soon as I get the file to her. Again, thank you everybody for sticking with us. Please look for us. We'll be meeting again same time next month. I believe we have scheduled a session with Rob Coleman's in the Netherlands, who is doing up his organization to go on hosting on premises the Access web apps from people who want to continue to use them. So I'm looking forward to hearing about how his organization is going to make that happen. So with that, I'll say goodnight. Thanks again to everybody, and especially thanks to George Young for keeping us all on the edge of our seats. Talk to you later. See you all next month.